When Americans talk about slavery and the slave trade, they often tell the story, perhaps understandably so, with America at its center. The Middle Passage in Africa, then, served merely as preludes to a narrative whose soul lies in this continent. In contrast, world historians and African historians are much more likely to frame the slave trade within its global and African context. There's good reasons, I think, to do so. If we look at all the slaves that were trafficked in the transatlantic slave trade out of West Africa, only about 5% end up in what will become the United States. That means that the vast bulk, 95% of the Africans trafficked in the transatlantic slave trade, end up elsewhere beyond the United States. If you add to that figure the other slave trades, the trans-Saharan slave trade, the slave trades to the Islamic lands, which start earlier and last longer than the transatlantic slave trade, that 5% figure drops down to 3 or 2%. And there are moments in the film that suggest these deeper, more global trade connections that showed us how deeply enmeshed Africa was in the world economy by an early date. Take, for example, the cowrie shells that appear regularly in the film. We know that cowries were used throughout West Africa as a form of currency. They appear, for example, in 14th century Mali. Cowrie shells, however, the ones that are used in trade at least, come only from the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean. Africans had been using them as a currency long before the arrival of Europeans. They used them, for example, in the trans-Saharan slave trade between North and West Africa. The arrival of the Europeans, though, wildly expands the use of cowrie shells as a currency within West Africa. Historians estimate that Europeans brought about 30 billion cowrie shells during the transatlantic slave trade to Africa. Europeans purchased the shells in India, exported them to Europe, where they are then re-exported to West Africa. In the region that the film is likely set, Benin, cowrie shells represented about 45% of the value of all the goods Europeans traded when they were purchasing slaves. Cowrie shells remained a form of currency in Africa until the late 19th century. We can see this trade between 4 continents in a cowrie shell excavated from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello estate. The cowrie shell was found in the slave quarters of his estate, and therefore was likely worn by an African slave. But it came from India via Europe. One edge of the cowrie shell has been worn down, and so again, likely was used as a piece of jewelry. There's a hauntingly beautiful scene in the film where there's a young girl playing with a fish in the moonlight. And it possesses a certain symbolism likely missed by American audiences, but one that would resonate deeply with West African audiences. The fish is a mudfish, and the mudfish has this unique ability to live both in the water and in the earth. It can in fact live for months on end in mud. And because in many West African religions, the world of the living and the dead is separated by a vast body of water, the mudfish represents the communication between those two worlds because the mudfish can survive in both worlds. Fascinatingly then, with the encounter with Europeans whose transatlantic movements mirror those of both the spirits and the mudfish, the Portuguese get incorporated into that spiritual worldview. There are any number then objects from 16th, 17th, 18th century Benin that include images of the Portuguese interwoven with images of the mudfish because they both represent this communication with the other world. The film was briefly controversial in 2001 because of its stark representations of the complicity of African elites in the transatlantic slave trade. But the notion that somehow African elites were innocent in the slave trade depends on a far more pernicious myth, the myth of a weak Africa. when Americans speak of or think about the slave trade and slavery in the New World, they often do so as if the slave trade was a representation of African weakness, emerged because of African weakness. But if we step back and think about the transatlantic slave trade within its global context, it's more obvious that the slave trade and New World slavery occurred precisely because Africa was strong, not because she was weak. If Europeans had been able to do in Africa what they had done elsewhere prior to their encounter with Africa, say, for example, the Atlantic islands, that is, conquer the land, enslave the inhabitants, and set up plantations, they would have. But African military might, from a very early date, squashes the European ambitions, and the Europeans are obliged, from the 16th century on, to trade on African, not European terms. The manner in which European slave traders had to conduct their business in human flesh on terms set by the African elite themselves is visible in this page from the captain's log of the slaving ship the Sally. Here, in this entry from December 23rd, the captain, Esek Hopkins, must pay his proper respects to the officialdom of the local African king on the Guinea coast. Went ashore to meet the king under the palaver tree, carried 5 kegs, 14 flasks rum, and paid the king 65 gallons for his customs, and received a cow as present. But the king knew how to bargain, and knew he was in a position to do so. The next day records the litany of payments to the various dignitaries before Hopkins' trade could begin in earnest. Waited on the king with a keg of rum, and he opened my trade by sending of a slave, for which I gave 112 gallons rum. Paid King Fidalgo Toko his customs, 36 gallons rum. Paid King's son his customs, for which I gave him 1 barrel, 2 kegs, 10 flasks rum. Paid the king's arger or high constable his custom, 25 barrels, 2 kegs, 6 flasks rum. Paid the geograph his customs, 30 barrels, 2 kegs, and 11 flasks rum. And so it went. European slave traders found themselves bargaining with local African elite who set the terms of trade. But it is important to remember that the complicity of African elites in the slave trade neither justifies the inequality that African Americans have faced in the United States or minimizes their magnitude. But if the Europeans were practicing a form of transcontinental arbitrage, buying cowries cheap in India and selling them dear in Africa, so too were the African elites. Male enslaved Africans fetched a far higher price in the New World than they did in Africa itself. And so it made economic sense then when King Agaja, who ruled the Dahomey Empire in the first third of the 18th century, decided to have an all-female army. Male captives in an army would have been a far more expensive proposition. This all-female warrior caste, then, becomes a dynastic tradition that persists in Dahomey until the late 19th century. And in fact, those female warriors almost beat the French in 1894. But if we speculate that the film is set in the Dahomey Kingdom in the late 17th or early 18th centuries, the film actually represents a curious mix of accuracies and inaccuracies. In the film, the king's palace is a rather simple affair. But what we know of the Dahomey Kingdom is the king's palace was actually a very complex setup. In fact, a complex setup that mirrored the complexity of the society itself. Take, for example, 19th century drawings from travelers' accounts of the Dahomey Kingdom. They reveal an elaborate wall enclosure, 30, 40 feet high, with a sophisticated gate system, one for the king, one for the commoners. I think the film is important for American audiences because it represents an African meditation upon the transatlantic slave trade. It allows American audiences to listen in on an African conversation about a series of horrific events that link together the entire globe.
Naza Mombuteo. Now Kolakina Bonsomie. Dekenali Kolona Kopumbwa. Lelona Komilo Kola Nyama Namotambo. My wife. Oh, my wife. Naza Mombuteo. Nakolakina Bonsomio. Dekenali Kolona Kopumbwa. Lelona Kominyama Namotambo.
Ayo,
Awa.
aye,
Oh, oh,
ayo,
Mawa.
aye, ayo,
Wow, oh, oh,
aye,
oh,
ayo,
Mawa, yeah.
aye.
Naza Mombuteo.